Welcome to the EC Graduate Seminar for this week. We are very, very fortunate and very pleased to welcome Cormac Herley from Microsoft Research in Redmond. Cormac has been with MSR for many years and has a very interesting background. He's been working on a lot of very different and very interesting problems, ranging originally from signal processing to security economics and to passwords. And Cormac is going to give us a tour of the password ruins, I understand. So definitely looking forward to that. So let's welcome our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here again. Passwords. A guide to the ruins and lessons for improvement. Well, okay. I don't know how sure I know how I came up with this title, but so I like to start talks these days with like, why are we here? I mean, why are we doing what we're doing, and why are we doing it, and why are we doing it now? It's like it's 2014, and why are we talking about passwords? Why are we have we not moved on? Why are we not talking about something else? Why are there still open questions in this? And what are we trying to do, and why? And one of the reasons I think the reason I'm here, I don't know why you're here, but the reason I'm here, I think, is this is my estimate of the number of password-protected accounts on the planet Earth as a function of time, and it's kind of it's kind of a back of the envelope calculation, but it goes from sub a couple of million, 1 or 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 million back in 1990 to I estimate on the order of about 20 billion password-protected accounts in use today, and that is an absolutely enormous growth. And to put kind of a couple of benchmarks on it for you, many of you kids are too young to remember a thing called the Netscape IPO, but that's where we were, roughly speaking, when that happened. Those of us who were around remember it as a big deal. That's the .com crash, which seemed like a big deal at the time. Here, Bill Gates says the password is dead at 2004, and it's just growing and growing and growing and growing. Just to fling out, I like numbers. I mean, if I'm roughly, forgive me by, a factor of 25% or so on the estimate, but this means that about 6 million new password-protected accounts are put into service every day. If you look at it over the last, 25 years, it's about a 28% compounded annual growth rate. I mean, essentially, not much grows at that. We don't, if you look at that graph, it doesn't look like peak passwords. We've hit that yet, and it looks like peak passwords are probably, many, many years in the future. And just one fun little, factoid. If you assume that 2 billion people are using the internet today, and let's assume that each of them types one password per day and spends 5 seconds typing it, well, the aggregate amount of human time spent doing that is, here's the calculation, and it comes out to be 1,388 person years per day spent just typing passwords. This is an enormous scale phenomenon, and it's very, very, very poorly understood. And that's what's kind of motivated me, and that's kind of why I'm here. That's why I'm kind of motivated to still work on this stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk kind of about two recent papers that I and some co-authors have had trying to make sense of this mess that we're in, and then I'm going to try to wrap it all together and kind of see what lessons what I think I've learned in the last couple of years working on this stuff, and whether you agree with me or not. So the first is managing a portfolio of passwords, which is responding to the phenomenon, and this was a paper with Danae Florencio and Paul Van Oerschoot at Usenix Security earlier this year. And it's responding to the observation that, when it comes to choosing a password, well, everybody knows, and there's, no shortage of blogs and advice and tips and best practices, and there's cybersecurity awareness months and blah, 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 blah. And everyone knows, you should choose, passwords that are random and strong, and passwords should not be reused across accounts. There's all sorts of other stuff as well, but these kind of, two are, largely invariant. And absolutely nobody does this. I mean, nobody does this, right? Including you, me, and everybody we know. Everybody ignores this. And yet we all kind of pretend that this is what you're supposed to do. And why do I say nobody does this? And, I'm talking here kind of, as, doing this in memory, not making use of, other tools like password managers or kind of, writing it down, which are, good things to look at. But if you're going to commit to memory, I claim absolutely nobody does this. And why do I make a claim like that? Well, if you look at, suppose I've got a portfolio of n, passwords. And personally, I did a count, and, 2 or 3 years ago, it was about at 100, and it's gone up since then. So with 100 unique passwords, what is the task that I have to perform if I'm going to carry out those two requirements that are referred to earlier? Well, here's, blah, blah, blah. Here's my, n or 100 different accounts, and I'm choosing things that are, very, strong and random, and blah, 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 blah. So clearly I have n times, and let's call the average password log s. I'm not going to commit to what that is. We can argue later whether that should be 20 bits or 100 bits or whatever. But let's just say n log s bits on average. But that's not all that I have to do. I've got to do one more thing. I've got to remember which password goes where, right? I've got to remember the end-to-end assignment of passwords to accounts. And that's something that doesn't come for free. And that's actually the number of n by n assignments that you can have is n factorial. So that's at least log 2 of n factorial bits that you have to remember in addition. So the total that I have to remember is I'm going to call it effort here, is n times log s, that's my n passwords, plus log of n factorial. And so if you just want to plug in some numbers there, let's assume that I have 100 of these things, which I definitely have, and there are people who claim they have 4, 5, 6, 700 of these things, each of log s bits. So I have n times log s bits plus n factorial. And what is log of 100 factorial? Well, it comes out to be 524. So your total budget here would be 4,000 plus 524 is 4,524 bits. Now, the reason that I kind of split this one out, so why am I bothering to even point out the 500 when the 4,000 seems to dominate? Well, one of the reasons I think that this is significant is that honesty demands that we kind of acknowledge that we don't have a good model of how, we talk about bits and entropy in terms of how difficult it is for an attacker to attack, but that's not necessarily a good model for how expensive it is for me to remember something. If I have 8 passwords and each of them is the name of a Hawaiian island, that's, it's really only 3 bits or so of information that I have to remember, whereas an attacker would take a lot more. So we don't actually have very good models on how expensive it is to remember. We know clearly the more random they are, the worse it is, but we know that people don't choose random, very random things, and they come up with all sorts of tricks to get around not having to remember 4,000 random bits here. But this part here, the reason why I point this out is this is interesting because the n by n assignment, if there's no connection between the password and the account with which it's associated, that's an incompressible log of n factorial bits. There aren't more efficient ways that we know of encoding this in less than that amount here. This is 524 effectively random incompressible bits that you've got to be remembering. And here's a picture, just in case any of you have forgotten what 524 random bits look like. It looks something like this. Sorry for the kind of comic effect there. And I claim this is effectively impossible. You cannot remember. You can remember, pictures. You can remember the human memory can do all sorts of stuff. But one thing it's not very good at is remembering random and incompressible stuff. This is, effectively, equivalent to remembering, well, you can, do the substitutions in your head. This is like remembering, the order of 2 shuffled card decks and stuff like that. Effectively, it's impossible. It's not something that you can really do. Even if you came up with a way of having the passwords each cost you nothing to remember, I claim you can't do this. You can't have 100 and do that assignment. It's just beyond the capacity of what most people can do. Maybe there are some people who can do it, but it's certainly not something that's within reach for, certainly not the average. So what do people do? So people basically have no choice. They have no choice. It's not something that is a shameful failing. They have no choice but to group things in certain ways. And so suppose instead of having the one each, I say I'm going to take my n accounts and I'm going to group them in g groups. So each group is going to effectively have n over g different entries. And there's some blah blah blah. There's a little bit of an approximation here. You've got to use Stirling's approximation for factorials and stuff. And what it comes out to be is your effort here is going to be g times of log s. That's, I've got g groups and therefore g passwords each of log s. And this thing n times log g. It's, so slightly, similar to what we had before. So if you just take this is the effort here. And so let's suppose for a fixed or finite level of effort, I want to see, well, how do log s, that is the amount of how random or how many bits I can afford to put in a password, how does that relate to the number of accounts that I have? Because I could have 100, I could put them all in one group and choose just one very strong password, or I could have 5 groups with far weaker passwords, or 4 groups, or any number of combinations in between. Well, if you pull across the log s here, it comes out to be something like this, and we can see that this is log s, the strength for a fixed amount of effort. I'm saying for my total portfolio, this is how much effort I'm going to spend. I know people want me to spend more, but this is how much I'm going to spend. What does that imply for the relation between log s and g? Well, there's a reciprocal relation. There is a strict trade-off between log s, the number of bits that I can afford to spend on the password, and the number of groups that I've got. So it's really a reciprocal relation. So what that means is that there really is a trade-off. And here I've taken for a couple of different, let's say, I'll take 700-bit budget, 550-bit budget, 400-bit budget. And what I'm doing here is I'm plotting in the log s, that is the number of bits I devote to the password, and the number of passwords, that is the number of account groups, for a n equal to 100 portfolio of passwords. Here are the available operating points that I can choose from. So if we look, for example, on the blue curve here, or the blue 400 bits, say, for example, I could have 4 passwords. That is, I put everything into a bucket of 25 accounts into a bucket, and there are 4 such buckets, and then what I would have is to spend on the number of password on each password would be about 50 bits. On the other hand, I could have 5 groups and go to a lower. The fact that you increase the number of buckets means that you have to decrease the number of bits that you've got to spend on it. So at fixed effort, there is this reciprocal relation. Log s is proportional to 1 over g. And a stronger password, you say, I want to have a stronger password? Sure. That's going to cost you. You're going to have to reuse more. You want to reduce the amount of reuse? That's going to mean you have weaker passwords. And, effort is kind of increasing in this direction. I mean, sure, if we spend more effort, we can improve both. But if you have a fixed effort situation, you can't. You've got to trade one off against the other. And the question is not, so for example, in deciding between 4 groups and 5 groups here, the question is not, does, avoiding reuse help things? Well, yes, it does. The question is not, does increasing password strength help you? Well, yes, it does. The question is not, does that make it better or worse? The question is, how are you going to trade off the relative goods of decreasing the amount of password reuse fractionally against increasing the password strength fractionally? So it's a strict trade-off here. There's no magic. There's no solution. We say, oh, well, I want to have everything. Well, you can't have everything. We've got to trade them off. So, and this is kind of, it's sort of one of those awkward moments when, we've been insisting that something is necessary here. We've been insisting that it's absolutely necessary that you not reuse passwords. And, it works out if you're going to have a finite budget of effort to take care of the situation. That's simply not on the table. I know you want that, but you can't have it. Not with finite effort. Not unless you're going to let things, grow unbounded. And it's interesting, and I want to kind of come back to this a little bit at the end, because I think it brings up a very interesting question. It's like, how did we end up insisting upon the necessity of something that ends up being functionally impossible? Because something can't be both impossible and necessary at the same time, right? So something went very awry in the logic that led us to this point, that led us to the place where we're insisting that it's absolutely necessary that you not reuse passwords ever. Clearly something is broken there. And I'll try to, illuminate where I think maybe some of the answer to that is, but, if we get to discuss it. So, and just... another way of looking at what went a little bit wrong here is it's like, if you look at those 2 bullet points, we said, okay, you should choose, random and strong passwords, and you should never reuse them. Why? Why? Well, what am I trying to accomplish? I mean, I'm used to, as Nicholas said, blah, 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 I used to do signal processing and information theory and stuff like that. And one thing that's very common in those domains is the idea of an objective function. Okay, you've got a certain set of constraints which you can meet or not meet. And once you've met the constraints, then you're trying to either minimize something or maximize something. What are we trying to accomplish here? Are we trying to minimize something? Are we trying to maximize something? And I think implicitly, it's never stated, but I think implicitly when we state that, well, you should choose things that are random and strong, and how strong they should be, stronger the better, and never reuse, it's always in response to, well, here's an ability to reduce risk. And I think implicitly the objective function that is not quite stated there, but implicitly the objective function is to minimize expected loss. And I want to show you why I think that is leading us in a very bad direction. Because okay, suppose here's a little kind of toy example of the example I'm talking about where I have n accounts, and let's just suppose for the moment that guessing is the only form of attack in the world. There's no key logging, there's no reuse attacks, there's none of that kind of stuff, and I just have 100 passwords, and I'm just trying to decide how I should allocate the effort in order to minimize my expected loss across this whole portfolio. And of course, not all accounts are equally valuable to me. Some of them might be very, very valuable, and some of them not so much. Well, so my expected loss over the whole portfolio here, L is the sum over 1 to n. That's all of the accounts. Is the probability of harm at a certain level of effort. So E is the amount of effort that I'm going to devote to a particular account, and EI is the probability given that level of effort. If I put in no effort, presumably the probability of having harm occur is very high, and otherwise not. And then each of those, of course, the probability times the actual loss, the actual damage that I suffer if this actual happens. Okay, so if that's what I'm trying to minimize, well, okay, I've got good news. If that's what we're trying to minimize, then optimality occurs when we take the derivative with respect to the only independent variable, which is effort. And that happens when dp de is equal to 0. And if you've got something where, well, the more effort you put in, if your risk of harm is reducing every time you put in more effort, well, there's a closed form solution. That's good news. The bad news is that closed form occurs at infinity. The right answer is to always invest more. How strong should your password be? Stronger. How strong is it right now? Much, much stronger. Keep going, keep going. Don't stop at 40 random characters or 60 or 100. Just keep going. You should never stop. And so when you find an engineering problem for which, okay, what I thought I was trying to optimize, the right answer is in a closed form and it's at effort equal to infinity, somewhere here I made a mistake. Let me see if I can find out where. And I think, okay, and here's, this is kind of, I think what went wrong is that, well, yeah, do you care about loss? You want to be safe, right? Yeah, I want to be safe. But you know what? I care about other things also. And other thing I care about is my effort. I am not going to invest infinitely to protect stuff that has limited and finite value to me. So suppose, humor me here. Suppose what I do is I say, well, what I want to optimize is not just, L, the expected loss. I want to minimize the expected loss plus the effort that I put into protecting it. And there's a good question around how do you map these, to the same variable. But, they all map to dollars in one form or another. Let's assume I can map time to dollars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I want to minimize loss plus expected effort. And it's just the same as I had before, but I just added this other term here. Now, what happens when I'm going to do the same thing? Optimality occurs when the derivative with respect to effort is equal to 0. But here, it's no longer 0 on the right-hand side. That extra term here, when I took the derivative, became transferred across. And the right answer is dpdi is not equal to 0, which occurs at infinity. It occurs at minus 1 over L. And what is L? L is the value of the asset. So the portfolio, when I was minimizing expected loss, the right answer was everything out at infinity. When I'm minimizing loss plus effort, the right answer is the amount that you invest on any given account is inversely related to the value of that account. So if you have, for example, something where L is very low, you really don't care about this. It's an account that you really don't care about. L is very small, 1 over L is very big. The probability of harm will be high. You're not spending much on it. It's weakly protected. When you're talking about something that's very valuable to you, L is very big, 1 over L is very low, so it should be way out on that curve because you really care about it and you invested a lot. Now here's the thing. It's like when you look at something like this and you see a breached password list and something like the RockU password list breaches and the number one password there is ABCDEFG or password or Snoopy or something like that. And what are these users thinking? Blah, blah, blah. Don't they pay attention? Well, maybe this is what they're thinking. Maybe they're thinking that L is really low and 1 over L is really high, and they don't care. Can you reduce the risk by placing effort here? Yes, you can. But the right answer is to not do that because you can better protect something that you care about more by putting the effort somewhere else. And that's the fundamental difference when you're managing a portfolio. It's not a question of, I have one thing and at all costs I want to protect it. It's, no, I have a portfolio of things and what I want to do is to get the best. So that's the consequence of having a portfolio view rather than a single view, and going after including the cost of the effort of protecting in doing what you're doing. Now, so I'm not going to drag you through all the details of, as I said, to make this model here, I said, well, assume there's only one form of attack in the world and it's guessing and there's no reuse and there's no key logging and there's no server breaches and stuff like that. Well, that was kind of saying, that risk was independent across accounts and each of these effort variables could be done. Well, those assumptions kind of all go away if you want to look at something. And so what we did in this paper was we kind of modeled the equations get a lot more complicated when you introduce those factors, but we kind of came up with an answer. I'm not going to drag you through all of those answers, but essentially the right answer when you go through a system of differential equations which are significantly more complicated than what I showed you there is the right answer appears to be that with your portfolio of n, you choose G to be somewhat small, and we haven't figured out a way of optimizing that variable, but you choose G to be on the order of 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or something. And then you group like with like. You put the valuable stuff together, and you put the last 50 passwords in a junk, which is actually probably, as far as we understand it, not that far from what real users actually do. In other words, what seems significant is that what users, and we have an imperfect understanding of what users actually do here, but it appears that what they actually do is closer to optimal than what we who apparently know about the problem have been insisting is necessary. It's like, okay, interesting. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But so the takeaways on chapter 1. I guess I'm structuring this like a Tarantino movie or something, but there'll be no blades or any of that, I hope, at least from me. One password per account is just impossible as n grows. It's just for all reasonable assumptions of what humans can do, it's just impossible. A strategy that rules out weak passwords is suboptimal. The right answer, there are many places where you can reduce the risk, yes, by choosing something that's stronger, but the right answer is to not do so. And finally, user practice is far closer to optimal than the advice that we've been giving them. So let me, that was kind of one kind of body of kind of work I wanted to talk about. And let me move on to the second. I'll come back to some of this stuff, at the end. But the second thing, with the same set of co-authors, Danae and Paul Van Oorschot, was administering a password-protected account. And, it's confusing out there. If you look at the blogosphere on passwords, and there's stories on passwords, and the passwords are dead, and soon some new technology thing is going to replace passwords, and then there's all sorts of people giving opinions and anecdotes and analogies and slogans, and there's flame wars, and it's seriously confusing out there. And and I've been working on this stuff for quite a while, and I have to confess, this paper was an effort to try to sort through some of the confusion. And when it comes down to it seems like it's all very confusing, but I think these were 4 basic questions that I wanted to try to get an answer to try to clarify the thing. And I think it kind of, reduces the problem to manage the size. So, well, there's all this confusing stuff. But when does strength actually matter? When is strength really a factor for passwords? How do we measure strength? How much strength do we actually need? And how do we achieve that needed amount? And I think if we can answer these questions, we're a long way toward making some progress here. So that's what I'm going to try to do one after another. So when is strength a factor? And one thing, it's often noted, but I think it can never be noted quite enough, is that the success of database breaches and client-side malware and phishing and things like network sniffing are entirely unrelated to password choice, right? Strength just doesn't, has nothing to say on these things. So the good, bad, and the ugly all suffer the same fate when there's a server breach as there was at RockU, and it turns out that things were plaintext. People who chose A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and people who chose something that was, 20 characters and random suffered exactly the same fate at exactly the same time for exactly the same reason. And stealing passwords is actually a lot more scalable than guessing them. So, the significance of these vectors where strength is not a factor at all, is important to bear in mind. How do we measure strength? Well, one thing I think is, used to be confusing, but I think, consensus has kind of emerged among the people doing work in this space in the last couple of years, is that, well, we've had a bunch of these kind of heuristic, entropy measures, often of the form, something like, well, you take length times, log of the size of the character set in which the password lives. And it has become clear that this is an extremely poor proxy for how easy or hard a password is to guess. And there's been a number of very good papers kind of written on this. Here's one kind of, graphic representation of it, where I sampled, I think it was 100,000 or 10,000 from the RockU data set. And what I plotted here is log 10 of the count, that is how frequently the password occurs in the RockU data set, which is a proxy for how easy it is to guess. The more common, so for example, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the most common RockU password, which occurs sometime greater than 100,000 times. And I graphed them against this measure, log x of, which has been used as a proxy for strength a lot. And all I, graphs, what are you supposed to notice? Well, the only thing I want you to really notice on this is that if this were a really good proxy for how hard something is to guess, that is to say how common it is, this would be monotonically decreasing in log 10 of count. And it's nowhere closer to that. It's not even approximately so. If you look at these are the single instance things here. These are things that occurred only once. And I think in my jet lag state this morning, I somehow did an off by 1 error and log 10 should be 1. But these are actually single instance things. Things that are single instance, these are very good passwords. These are things in a data set of 32 million occurred only once. No matter what they are, they're pretty good. It's very difficult for an attacker to build a dictionary that gets to these. They range from, it looks like, on the order of 15 bits up to 140. That's the estimate that this proxy is giving us, and it's just all over the map. It's not even any kind of. So the right answer in this space is, we use partial guess numbers. We use things that are how much effort does it take to get to a certain fraction of the distribution. Here's how many guesses it takes an attacker to get to 5% or 10%, and draw those curves. And I think there's, finally we've gotten to consensus that that's the correct. The correct way of doing it. So, okay, so that's how do we measure strength? Then, well, how much strength do we need? And here things get a little more complicated. There are two very, very, very different types of attacks, and there's online guessing and there is offline guessing. What is the difference between these? Well, for online guessing, essentially, the attacker is computing on our hardware. I mean, if I'm running a website and someone is doing an online guess, he has a script, but basically all of the computation is happening on my hardware. So I've got the opportunity to do lockout, I've got the opportunity to do rate limiting, I've got the opportunity to do forensics, I've got the opportunity to monitor accounts and see, did people who get guessed more, get hijacked and stuff like that. I've got more opportunity for remediation. And then there's offline where he's computing on his hardware. He has a nice rig of GPUs or something that he bought, or more likely stole, the resources from Amazon or Azure or someone like that. And he's limited only by hardware. And he just computes away, and he computes, against against the hashes. So you might ask yourself, well, why would anyone do the hard one up here when you're computing on someone's hardware when it seems like you could do a great deal more down here? Well, the problem here is that he needs to get his hands on the file of hashed passwords. And that's not something that generally is handed out for free if you ask nicely. That's something that is supposed to be very well protected. He needs to steal the file of hashed passwords, and he needs a couple of other things also. And so I tried to kind of clarify when is offline guessing truly a factor. And here's my attempt to kind of clarify this space where you have at an authentication server you have a file that contains the passwords or something derived from the passwords in a certain form. And when is there an offline attack? Well, first of all, there's no offline attack if it doesn't leak. Unless the guy gets the password file, he's not going to, there's no offline attack, obviously. So it only, happens when something happens on this, it does leak. Well, if the leak is detected equally in a well-configured system, it's not trivial, but presumably there should be a forced password reset across the system, which kind of severely limits the amount of time that he's got. So largely speaking, we're talking about he gets the password file, it leaks, and the leak goes undetected. And then what happens next depends critically on how that file was stored. If it was stored plain text, well, then he doesn't have to guess anything, right? He just reads off, and there the passwords are. They're just in plain text. If they were hashed but unsalted, well, there are rainbow table attacks that now will get you 97%, 98%. So effectively, that's not quite as good as plain text, but it gets you most. If they're salted and hashed, which is kind of the best practice, for want of a better term, then he does have an offline guessing attack. And then finally, there's this option of reversibly encrypted, where, and if things are reversibly encrypted, well, there's two cases. He got in and he got out. He got in and he got out undetected. But did he, while he was in there, did he get the decryption key or not? Well, if he gets the decryption key, well, then it's back to plain text again, right? He doesn't have to guess anything. He just checks them off. If he doesn't get the decryption key, well, he doesn't really have an offline attack anymore. He still has, ciphertext, and he can try to guess this piece of ciphertext. Does it correspond to the password Snoopy? But he doesn't have the decryption key to verify when he gets it right or not. So he still doesn't have, so still online attacking is pretty much the best you can do. So in this whole suite of stuff here, the thing I want to draw attention to is, the set of circumstances where offline guessing is both possible and necessary is a far smaller segment of the decision tree than you actually might think. So, well, okay, but that's surely in 2014 nobody stores things plain text or reversibly encrypted or any of those other non-preferred practices. Well, and this is where it gets a little. Not quite. If you look at, here's a collection of, a random collection of, recent data breaches, RockU, Gawker, blah, blah, blah. And I've kind of, checked off here, was it hashed, was it salted, was it reversibly encrypted? And yes or no, was there an offline guessing attack? And, RockU, well, it was plain text, no. Gawker, 1.3 million, well, they did it actually right. These guys, plain text, hashed but not salted, hashed but not salted. Adobe was reversibly encrypted. In only 2 of these cases here was, were things done. And these are, breaches that have all occurred in the last just couple of years. And kind of later breaking news, since we kind of actually finished that paper, August 2014, there was like, it kind of hit the blogosphere, but there was this cybervore breach of, originally was advertised at like 4 billion passwords, but when all the deduping and stuff is done, it seems like it comes out to be a significantly smaller number, but that's like on the order of 1.2 billion passwords, which are plain text. In other words, passwords are being found in enormous numbers in plain text that seems to dwarf the numbers that we're seeing that are actually encoded in the correct way, and you might think that this would stuff like this would only happen at the kind of places that you wouldn't like to be associated with, and but not altogether so. Not altogether so. Plain text and reversible encryption is actually a lot more common than you think, especially at universities. And for example, here is a little segment from some of our an excellent password paper written by some of our friends at CMU. It's like, well, the university was, and the paper appeared in 2013. I think it was up until 2012. The university was using a legacy credential management system since abandoned, which to meet certain blah, 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 reversible encryption. Leibniz University, another password research group over there, found the same thing. And you might think, well, those are just two examples. Well, I think the bias in these examples is these are the only samples from, really good, solid people who are doing research. I think if every university on the planet had a group, researching this stuff with the same care, we would find that, we would find a lot more for that. One of the reasons, and just to be clear, I mean, it's easy to assign blame, and it's easy to kind of say, oh, people are stupid, they don't know what they're doing. It's like, well, one of the reasons that this happens is that the Radius protocol to support dial-up, until there are a couple of protocols like CHAP and PAP that were very common and weren't replaced in commodity operating systems until on the order of the year 2000, 2001. And which required, in order to have Radius succeed, required that the password be available plaintext, which meant that either you had it reversibly encrypted or you could get your hands on it. And then, and if you assume that support for those legacy operating systems was necessary for at least a decade after that point, it's like, well, at least until 2010, 2011, a lot of universities where you have a very diverse set of systems to be supported were using this in great numbers. Okay, and reversible encryption, at least it's, maybe it sounds better than plaintext, and it is in a certain sense. But remember, the reason that I wanted to draw attention to it was, well, I said, if it's reversibly encrypted, the guy either gets the key or he doesn't get the key. And if he gets the key, it's plaintext, and he doesn't need to do any guessing. And if he doesn't get the key, he can't do any guessing. So there's really not an offline attack anyway. And there was another little gem in this paper from our friends at CMU, which says, well, in that same system where things were reversibly encrypted, passwords had to be of greater than length 8 and include upper or lower special characters and digits. Well, this is an effort to impose a strong policy which presumably will resist not an online attack, but an offline one. And this was a complete waste of human effort. There was no possibility under that existing system of an offline attack. In other words, I don't know how many of you were here in CMU in 2012, but your time was wasted for absolutely no reason whatsoever. This is something that imposed usability cost for no security benefit. There was no scenario in which there was going to be an offline attack, and all this stuff was just kabuki theater to... Anyway. So large-scale waste of effort based on just confused thinking. And, there's yes, a complete stranger from the audience.
I'd like to point out that it wasn't confused thinking at CMU, and CMU had to agree with other people.
Fair. And actually, to be fair, I mean, I think a lot of people who are tasked with administering stuff like that are forced into compliance regimes where even they probably realize far quicker. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff, I've talked to a bunch of university administrator things, and some of the thoughts that I'm putting kind of in stark form and expressing in an antagonistic fashion, for the want of a better word, they have realized some of this stuff 5 years ago, and they said, you know what, I mean, this is what it has to be. I know it's nonsense, but, it's not. People who run real systems tend not to be religious about stuff, and they tend to know what the real threats are. Yeah, good point, thanks. Was it?
I just wanted to make another observation, which is that this type of policy would actually be also definitely overkill, but that could be useful in weeding out the weaker passwords that could be guessed in online attacks. And so you kill two birds with one stone, but it's a very large stone.
It's a very large stone. We agree.
Those passwords, right?
Sure. True. Okay, so let's. Okay, so online, offline, right? And as I said, the guy's running on his hardware or your hardware, but when he's running offline, it's a limited set of circumstances, and if you imagine everyone is doing it the right way, it doesn't appear to be the case. But anyway, so in the online, if we look at Okay, and as I said, I think the right way to measure this is in terms of the number of guesses. How many guesses, if I'm going to, and I kind of railed against this, how strong should your password be? Well, stronger, stronger, stronger. How strong is enough? No, just keep going, stronger, stronger, stronger. Well, I think, that's a reasonable point of view if, effort equal infinity is a possibility. When it's not, I think we've got an obligation to draw the threshold at a finite number. And here's my effort anyway, and I'll show you the reasoning kind of a little bit next. But, for an online breadth-first attack where basically someone is going against an undifferentiated population, he's not after you in particular, he's just attacking people in general, looking for the weakest links. If you stand up to 10 to the 4 guesses, that is, 10,000, you're probably safe against a breadth-first attack against a properly administered server. That is, so for an example, a password like, a 4-digit random PIN is probably pretty much what you need. For an online depth-first attack where he's really going after one person in particular, he wants you and he's not going to waste any of his guesses anywhere else, it's like 10 to the 6, which is something like, tin can 24 or something like that. Offline, where the guy is going to go, he's got, and I'll explain the computing rig that I think that are the basis of these numbers. Breadth first, in order to be to have any expectation of surviving an offline attack that is breadth first, you need to withstand about 10 to the 14 guesses. An example of this is something like this, which is this 7 characters, random thing, drawn from across the distribution space. And an offline depth first, where he's going after you, it could be up to about 10 to the 20 or so, where you need something, I can't remember whether this is 13 or 14. And well, what do you notice here with the kind of example passwords that will withstand the various attacks? Trivial, easy, pretty bad, and you got to be kidding me, right? There's just this enormous gulf between what it takes to withstand an online attack and an offline attack. And there's no continuum of possibilities in between here. It's not like, there's something that's half online and half online. No. There's one or the other. And that gap, and so the reasoning, roughly speaking here, I mean, it's laid out in greater detail, but the online estimates are kind of somewhat easy to reason about. Why? Because he's running on our hardware, and how do we know what the hardware is capable of? Well, we bought it, so we ought to know. So I assume for an online breadth first, over a 4-month period, if you assume that the guy guesses, but most of the time he fails. As a matter of fact, with the most common password, he fails 99% of the time. Most of his events are fails. If he sends 10 to the 4 guesses over a 4-month period against the legitimate population, and I assume that every legitimate user is logging in once per day and fails 5% of the time due to typos and stuff like that. At this level, damn it, what did I do there? At that level, 10 to the 4, he would be sending 17,000 times more fail events than the entire legitimate population put together. In other words, any system administrator should spot this sticking out by a mile. The analysis is kind of similar for depth first, is that you shouldn't be allowing 10 to the 6 failed distinct attempts against any particular account on a well maintained system. For offline, we don't know what hardware he's got, so making some assumptions, I'm saying on an offline breadth first, I'm assuming he's got 1,000 GPUs. Each of these GPUs can do 10 billion guesses per second, and he's guessing against 1 million accounts. That's what, so this hardware running against 10 to the 6 accounts for 4 months, that's the number of guesses. That's the number of guesses he can spit out. And if instead he puts the same hardware going against a targeted attack of like 10 accounts, that puts him up to 10 to the 21 or 20, I can't remember which one was there. So anyway, that's kind of the reasoning there. But the point of all this was that, there was an enormous gulf. As I said, 10 to the 4, 10 to the 6, 10 to the 14, and 10 to the 20. It's like, well, as you go, and here's a kind of an effort to capture this in a graph. It's like, well, here's log 10 of the number of guesses a password will withstand, and here's your risk. So for an online, which is the blue here, I claim that, if you'll only withstand, 10 to the 0 or 10 to the 1 or 10 to the 2, your risk of being guessed is extreme, high, moderate. But by the time you get to 10 to the 6, it's effectively negligible. For offline, nothing really happens until you get to on the order of 10 to the 14 guesses or so. You can't really have much confidence that you're going to withstand a well-resourced offline attacker who's got a good rig and persists. So in between 10 to the 6 and 10 to the 14, what happens? Well, passwords that fall in here, they're too strong. I mean, they've exceeded by a considerable amount the threshold to stand up to an online attack, and they fall short of the one to survive an offline attack. And while there's no brownie points for excess, you've got 2 hurdles to clear. One of them, effectively, 8 orders of magnitude is a lot. So if the first hurdle was 6 inches, I worked it out. The next one is about 10,000 miles high. So there's a lot of difference between jumping much higher than 6 inches. Instead of jumping 6 inches, suppose you jumped a mile. No brownie points. You've got no gain for clearing that extra unnecessary distance. Until you get all the way to 10 to the 14, you're not seeing any incremental return. There's no scenario. So take, for example, a password that will withstand 10 to the 6, which would be a 6-digit random pin, for example, and compare it with something that is twice the length. It's a 12-digit random pin. I claim that the security properties of these are the same, in the sense that they will both withstand an online attack and neither of them will withstand an offline attack, and that the extra effort put in the 10 to the 12 is not accomplishing anything. There is really not an attack scenario in which it makes a difference and meaningfully protects the account. So that was, how much strength is needed and stuff like that. So how do we achieve the needed amount of strength? So, since I'm liberally being antagonistic, to composition policies. Well, composition policies, just seem extraordinarily poor ROI. They're, first of all, as I said, they're unjustifiable when there's no offline risk, right? If you're storing things plaintext or you're storing things reversibly encrypted, they simply are unjustifiable in the sense that there's no risk, there's no security situation in which they end up making a difference. But on top of that, they protect, inadequate protection even against online. If you look at things that are fully compliant with some of the really super strong password policies, some of them that, in the top 10,000 of the RockQ leaked distribution, there are plenty of passwords that actually are compliant with very strong policies, but won't even stand up to a breadth-first online attack. Blacklisting, which is one of my favorite approaches, is, well, there kind of isn't, strength can give us the idea that there's this kind of continuum and more is better. But actually, I kind of think that there's kind of 2 passwords. There's, 2 types. There's ones that will withstand online and there's ones that will stand offline. And if you want to just take care of online, in particular breadth-first online, 10 to the 14 guesses, well, just use a blacklist. Just take the 10,000 most common choices and just say these are banned. They're done. And then it gives good protection for online, and it inconveniences only those who need it, instead of a password policy which inconveniences those who chose maybe simple all lowercase characters that are easy to put on mobile devices, but are uncommon enough to not show up on anyone's list. And what about the offline attacks? What are the good tools there? Well, I'm not sure what I think the right answer there is, I think it's not a great idea to be consuming user effort in an attempt to defend against offline attacks, and here's why. And here's kind of, and this is not a proof. This is, my kind of, accumulating what I think is the case to be made on that side of the argument. First is that we don't know how to do it. Honesty kind of requires that we confess that composition policies, they do they get some users across that threshold, but they leave, the vast majority of them straggling somewhere in the chasm where there's no benefit at all. Advice and meters and things like this largely haven't managed to get people across the chasm. Second reason is, it's generally unnecessary, right? If you protect, the right answer is to not let the file that stores the passwords leaks, and to make sure that you can detect it and force a reset if it does. But that's kind of at the server end job. Dumping the burden on users seems to me to be I'm not sure it's the right way of answering the problem, given the enormity of the additional hurdle that we're asking of them. It's an entire waste if, the passwords are plain text or reversibly encrypted. Exceeding the online threshold, but falling short of the online is just complete waste. It doesn't really accomplish anything. The task gets harder every year as hashing and GPUs get better and better. They respond to Moore's law. Human memory does not. And I'll talk about this just in a little bit second, if I've got a couple more minutes. Zero user burden effort solutions exist. So, summary, I would say, online, getting users to choose passwords that will withstand online attacks. This is a defensible line. This is a very defensible line that currently is actually very poorly defended. We're not even enforcing things like blacklists ubiquitously, which more or less take care of this problem. And the offline is a goal that just looks extremely extremely remote. And it seems more important to make sure that everyone withstands an online attack before we put the effort into making sure that anyone withstands an offline attack. Okay, so. If I've got, we're kind of at the top of the hour, but, let me say, what are the lessons? What are the lessons from all of this? I think, it's somewhere in this space we kind of, it's been going on for a long time, and we've kind of lost the plot to a degree that is extreme. And how can we make things a little better? One thing, it always amuses me when I see, when we find ourselves looking at the same evidence and reaching not merely different conclusions but opposite conclusions. So, for example, when we see password breaches and people leap upon them and say, users still haven't learned their lesson and look how weak these passwords are. And the only reason that we're looking at these passwords is that they were stored plain text when there really wasn't an offline guessing attack. When we're kind of denying the obvious that the problem is that we're not storing and protecting servers properly, not that users are choosing weak passwords. You can argue that actually users were right to choose the weakest password that they could get away with, given that the real threat was an attack on the server, not anything else. Another one that is kind of a favorite of mine is every time there's a breach, and there have been a number in the last year or so, and it's kind of touted as evidence that passwords passwords are dead. And it's like, well, except what happened here is, we have evidence not that passwords are dead, but we have evidence that we don't seem to know how to protect databases of secrets, even when we know those databases of secrets are very important and there are people attacking them. Which means that, so suppose you have something like, instead of being a database of passwords, it had been a database of biometrics. Well, when you've breached and the secret is now out there, if you have an authentication mechanism that depends on a database of secrets and that secret breaches, what's important now? Well, revocation and reset is really important. You want to guess what has the best revocation story on the planet right now in terms of authentication mechanisms out there? Passwords, essentially, right? So every time we have kind of breaches, it's like, well, things like biometrics have a far bigger problem addressing stuff like this. And it seems like important problems here, I think, looking at mechanisms, authentication mechanisms and alternatives that have better revocation and reset is a really good research area. Protecting databases of secrets seems like something that, we know it's important, but, I don't think we've done as much on this as perhaps we could. And here's kind of, just a, one tiny illustration, which is, look, is it the case that choosing stronger passwords, choosing very strong passwords will, help withstand offline attacks? Yes, it is. Is that the only way of preventing, offline attacks and access to? No, it's not, right? There are lots of other ways of doing it. And if you want to look at it in terms of, big O notation, if you've got a population of users, and when the population is large enough to be a scale of, of Hotmail or, Facebook or something like that, this is an order n approach to the problem. When you are trying to, get each user to put in effort, that's an order n solution where n is the number of users at the service. Now, it's kind of embarrassing if we're advocating for an order n solution if there actually do exist constant time solutions which do not consume, effort that is, linear in n or log n or anything like it. So, if you remember in that tree where I said, salted hashes were kind of, the best thing, and reversible encryption was an interesting one. Because if the guy gets the key, then it's the worst solution in the world. It's the same as plaintext. But if he doesn't, it's pretty much the best. Because even though he got in and got out undetected, he still doesn't have anything better than an online attack. So, I'm not a crypto guy or an applied crypto guy, but there are, mechanisms to make sure that we could have some confidence that we could protect, the key and not have, to make offline attacking essentially not possible, even if the guy gets in and out. And I know it sounds kind of, that sounds like wishful thinking. But here's a nice little. It's my favorite kind of hashing scheme, and it's due to Crescenzo and Lipton. It was a couple of years ago, and it's probably a little bit impractical, but it's just to demonstrate that this is possible, and there are solutions on the table that we have not picked up on. And basically, the authentication server is blah blah blah. It does something, and your password comes in, and it computes a hash. And the hash is not SHA-1 or MD5 or anything like that. The hash is basically of the form. The authentication server is connected to this other box that has a terabyte of random bits. And in order to compute a hash, it has to index randomly into this terabyte of bits. And here's the key thing. The terabyte of bits is connected to the authentication server in a physically limited fashion. It's a 96K modem or something like that. Why? Why is that significant? Well, remember what I said, when the guy was trying to do guesses, even in the online case, he had to send way more fail events than the entire legitimate population combined. You can actually, physically match, the capacity of this cable to the expected number of fail rates that you expect on your system. So that even if the guy gets in, even if he can get in and get out, he can't pull the terabyte of bits. This terabyte of bits is connected to the world by this wire and nothing else. Even if he gets in and gets out undetected and can party his heart out, he still can't. I'm not advocating it as a practical solution to the problem, but I think there exist solutions here that do not put the burden on users, and they would seem to merit effort. The other, and finally, this is my kind of, stepping, maybe 3 million feet back and blah, blah, blah. One thing that was very, very, as I said when I was talking about the password portfolio stuff, it's like, okay, so we ended up talking about, okay, the right thing to do is, never reuse passwords and choose them random and strong, blah, blah. And then it turns out it's impossible. How did we end up advocating for the necessity of something that turns out to be impossible? There's something wrong with our thinking. There was another kind of paper that made me think of this, and it was the paper on where I and some co-authors looked on the various schemes out there to replace passwords, and everybody hates passwords, and everybody thinks they're really bad, and we kind of tried to tabulate, okay, what are the desirable properties that you have, including security properties and usability properties of a replacement for passwords, and we kind of tried to figure out which of them has which. And it works out that, well, if you write down all the requirements that you think are absolutely necessary in a replacement for passwords, the set of things that satisfies that set of requirements appears to be empty. In other words, the things that we've satisfied ourselves are absolutely necessary. There's nothing there. How does this happen? How does it happen that we end up, and this is what the rest, many other communities that I've been involved in would recognize as like, well, this is what's called an overconstrained problem. You've got 17 equations and 3 unknowns. There's no solution. You either drop some of the equations, or you use mean squared error. You kind of come up with approximation techniques. How did we end up kind of with an overconstrained problem here? And if you look at the portfolio question, and because I think it's more interesting than fixing this particular problem, is there's something broken upstream in our logic where we end up insisting on the necessity of things that are impossible and repeatedly find ourselves in over-constrained problem spaces. And if you look at what's the reasoning that leads to, well, you should never reuse passwords anywhere. It's like, well, is reuse a real threat vector? Yes, absolutely it is. I mean, whenever there's a breach, and it appears online, Microsoft and Facebook and everybody else sees these guesses show up against their authentication servers. Do bad things happen because of reuse? Yes, absolutely. People's accounts are broken into, bad things happen. Can you eliminate that risk by avoiding reuse? Yes, you can. Does it follow, D, that you should never use passwords from A, B, and C? No, it doesn't. Just as a matter of logic. Just as a matter of logic. X implies Y does not mean that not X implies not Y. It just doesn't, right? The fact that you can eliminate a risk by taking a certain action does not mean that that action must be taken. Because what happened here? We said, well, I start with one password, and I say, okay, that's fine. Now I've got two passwords I shouldn't reuse because now there's risk. Now I have 3, and now I have 4, and now I have 5, and now I have 6. Well, if you go to, and at 100, I think it's clear that it's impossible. But suppose I grow it out to have 1,000 passwords. At what point in the process am I checking that the additional constraints that I'm adding are not mutually incompatible? At no point, right? We just continue to add constraints because, and it's confusing. This is a sufficient condition to avoid the bad outcome. But that doesn't make it a necessary condition, and it almost certainly is not. And I think we'll keep falling into that trap in many, many places. Anyway, that's kind of my sort of philosophical wrap up. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
So we have about 20 minutes, a little less than 20 minutes for questions. So.
Rich. 10 to 14. 10 to 14, I said.
Well, that's what you said, right.
Okay.
You didn't like the use of 10 to the 12 guesses, but I wanted to try to defend that a little bit.
So just to be clear, you want to defend what now? Okay.
Using 10 to the 12 guesses as a reasonable security.
Okay.
So the entire premise of defending against an offline attack is predicated on the idea that the service provider is taking good steps to protect the passwords. If the service provider is, say, storing the passwords in the clear, then there is no offline attack. It's over as soon as the password file is stolen. So the idea of using password strength to mitigate that already depends on passwords being hashed and salted. And I think one of the items that is reasonable to add to the assumptions that a service provider is doing is that the service provider is using a slow hash. Now, I think you had 10 to the 10 guesses per second on the slide as how many hashes.
Yes. So if you use an iterated hash, such as in bcrypt or something like that, it certainly, so if you iterate the hash 10 to the 3 times, it would take it from, my estimate goes from 10 to the 14 down to 10 to the 11. I mean, you still have something. How widely used decrypt is?
I agree. In fact, decrypt is exactly what I was basing this on. Just using our own machines on using OSTEL hashtag. If someone had those 10 machines, just quick calculation, it would take about 6 months to get to 10 to the 12 guesses. And
the numbers, particularly the offline number, is. Let me make the generic form of the argument. I claim that there is a threshold above which online guessing is of the risk from online guessing above a certain threshold is negligible. I claim that there's another threshold where until you clear that, you can't be confident of withstanding an offline. I claim that the second threshold is bigger than the third threshold, and I claim that A, B, and C imply D, that there's no incremental benefit in increasing strength in that gap. Now, whether the second gap is, if you've done bcrypt and you have, set 10 to the 8 iterations, but then your authentication server has turned into a big rig with GPUs and stuff. But if you've done 10 to the 8 guesses, then the gap closed. There's still no benefit in going beyond 10 to the 6 because now the offline threshold just became the online threshold, right? The gap closed, but there's no benefit to going beyond 10 to the 6. The gap is a little. I mean, arguing about 10 to the 14 versus 10 to the 12 is less of interest than I claim. Those thresholds are far apart. That's my main claim. And in between, there's not much return on effort. There's none. Oh, yeah.
Just a quick follow-up on that is that a way in which what's in between might matter is if you're not worried about the indeterminate length offline attack, but the offline attack is going to take half a day until your provider figures out that something happened and shuts off.
Yeah, so the part of the decision tree that I think is, I mean, another good kind of question for research, I think, that has been kind of under is like if the attack is detected, well, there's some places where, we're going to reset, like if Carnegie Mellon figures out there's been a breach, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's going to be painful, but you can tell everyone, well, you got to show up in the gym 9 o'clock in the morning and it's going to be like a zoo, but, you'll get it done. Everyone shows their ID card, you'll issue new credentials. There are other places where, if you're someone, a web service that has never had in-person proofing with your customers, that kind of, and you don't have a second factor like a phone or another channel, email is what people, that's a hard one, but I think it merits, because it's a real question. It's a real question, yeah. Yes?
I'm wondering how the password manager, where people can use just one master password and still use site-specific.
So, password managers are, I never quite know what to say about password managers, because password managers are, if you use a password manager on your machine and your machine only, and only on your laptop, and you never access any of your accounts from anything other than your laptop, effectively you turn this into a dongle. That's now a physical device that, and now your passwords can all be arbitrarily strong. You don't need to remember them all. And that's a good solution. I mean, it's from a security point of view, it seems to me. If you upload the store, you back it up anywhere, or you store it in the cloud, the properties changed enormously. So if you upload this to the cloud and then you access another thing, well, now you change to, it's like there's one group and one password unlocks all of them. You can kind of, the password that unlocks all of them can be very strong, and each of those individual passwords can be very strong. And you may have reduced to negligible or even eliminated both online and offline guessing risks, but the risk of being keylogged or having a breach of that server, and so it's not clear to me that, suppose the risk of being, it's not hard for me to imagine that the risk of being keylogged or having a server breach might be 2 orders of magnitude bigger than the risk of online or offline guessing. And it could be that a 1% increase in this risk is far worse than totally eliminating that risk. So it's on the other hand, the reason I say I have mixed feelings, that didn't sound like mixed feelings, that sounded like an emphatic point of view. The reason I have mixed feelings is I think from a usability point of view, we kind of have to do something, right? I mean, personally, I write them down and I've got a photocopy in the drawer at home and stuff. I don't personally use, but I think that serious attention to, I think it would be a good step if we could stop pretending that memorizing 100 random passwords was a reasonable thing for people to ask, and that writing them down is not a crime, and that using password managers is not, and there may be, but I think that they haven't received the kind of, they're starting to receive, but they haven't really received the comprehensive academic treatment that they should, because we've been focused for a long time on telling people to do the impossible. That's kind of mine. Yes?
What do you think of these password apps? I noticed that there are dozens of password apps available for the iPhone. They all get 5-star ratings. There's a very good XKCD cartoon about 5-star ratings, and it's about a tornado warning app, and it has a 4-star rating, and it's like the first says, oh, I love it, the new interface is great, and blah 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 blah, and then the last is a 1-star rating, and it says, did not warn me about tornado that destroyed my house, right? I'm not sure. I personally don't use. I think on phones it's kind of like, well, the security may be. I'm not sure whether it got better or worse, but I think given the insanity of the password composition rules that we have and the wretchedness of trying to input them on soft keyboards with your thumb, there seems not to be much alternative, right? So I don't personally use one. I don't kind of access much stuff from my phone, but I think. I don't use one either. I was just wondering if you know cases where somebody's passwords, all of them got stolen.
I'm sure it happens. I'm sure they're badly written and badly configured, and I'm sure that.
Well configured. They purposely chose to steal your.
Yeah, I mean, the incompetence is probably more common than but.
There's been billions of passwords stolen. So.
No, absolutely. I'm not sure.
I think that password management space, there haven't really been that many serious kind of papers kind of looking on it. So if I would kind of respond, I would be kind of saying, hey, what I've kind of picked up by reading the newspapers and the blogosphere, I haven't personally studied them in as much detail, and there haven't been that many. There was one paper at Usenix Security, I think, this year. So it's starting to get serious treatment, but it's, you know, it's not as mature as it should be, given that the alternative seems to be impossible, and, you know, this problem isn't going away. So it seems like serious treatment of this question is definitely in order, but I haven't done it. Yes?
How do you feel about just abandoning them altogether? Either carrying some kind of a token or biometrics or any of those other alternatives?
Well, I mean, that's what, I mean, I kind of, mentioned this paper when we kind of looked at, you know, the alternatives to passwords, and kind of the conclusion was, you know, passwords are the worst system in the world, except right now for all the other systems, right? There are a lot of things where, okay, that have, you know, stronger security properties, but when you look at usability, you know, they kind of fall short, and it's not clear. You know, some of those things may be patchable, but biometrics is one that people ask about a lot. But the problem that, you know, that you can't cancel a biometric, that you can't, you know, if it's become compromised and the secret is out, what do I do now? I mean, and that's not a minor. I mean, passwords, the flaws of passwords are plain for all to see because we all use them all the time. It's always in the news. You know, some of the flaws of other systems are not as apparent because, you know, well, we haven't been using them, right? If you have to use something that takes, you know, where the login time, as I said, you know, 5 seconds to type in a password, if it takes 5 seconds, one password each for 2 billion users comes out to be, you know, 1,400 person years per day, right? If you say, okay, instead of 5 seconds, the login procedure is now, you know, a 30-second procedure, right? That's a huge, you know, and, you know, some of us are unlocking our screen tops multiple times per day. Situations where, you know, if you lose your token or it gets stolen or you forget it, and you know, there are situations where wait 24 hours and you'll get a new one is not an acceptable answer, right? I think we're probably going to be stuck here with passwords for at least the lower value part of the spectrum for some time, would be my impression. It'll go away, but not as quickly as people have been counting on, I think. Yes?
So in chapter 1, you said that the instructions are indefensible, or something along those lines.
That sounds like something I would say, yes.
They seem to result in near optimal behavior, which somehow makes them sound pretty defensible.
No, well,
I think it was the right. Well, I guess you.
Oh, yes.
The assertion, right, that we're telling people all the wrong things, and I kind of agree. But then you also said, well, people somehow seem to do the right thing in practice, which would seem.
And so you claim this was a genius effort to manipulate users into it. You play a very deep game. That's a. I had not thought of this, I have to say. Well played. Yes.
Sorry to go again.
No.
But about 10 slides back, you talked about zero burden user efforts because passwords exist.
No. I said zero. What I meant by that basically was. What did I do? What I meant by that was essentially the scheme that that was the scheme that I described with the terabyte of bit. Oh, what happened here? Where did I pull it out? I mean, that's not zero user effort. It's zero user effort for the going beyond. You know, in withstanding offline. What I'm kind of claiming is that, look, if you jump on, there's no way of getting around there's no way of removing from users the burden, at least that I see, the burden of withstanding an online attack. The incremental effort above that, which is not incremental, it's, you know, enormous, to get to an offline attack. If you do this thing involving the terabyte of bits where there's a physical constraint, and even if the guy gets in and gets out and you never detect it and blah, 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 he still can't compute the hashes, he still can't compute the guesses, and he still can't get the bits out. That does not put you have pretty strong guarantees against an offline attack, and none of that burden got placed on your user population.
I didn't understand that. I guess I need to read it. But
Sure. It's a very simple scheme. It's basically you're just I'm gonna botch the actual details, but the trick is that in order to compute the hash, you need to index randomly into this terabyte of bits, and a block of bits that is so big, but the physical pipe that connects the terabyte of bits to the server that is making the requests is so narrow, it's like a twisted pair or something. So it doesn't have the capacity to handle much more than the actual legitimate fail burden. Because one thing that's very different about people who have to, the real users know the passwords, so the fails happen. People have typos and things like that. But the real guy is guessing, and he generates, even the most common password is, password, which is 1%. So even if he guesses that, he's going to fail 99% of the time. He's generating fails at orders of magnitude higher than the legitimate population. And you're
slowing down the adversary. I was hoping that you'd have some way to
no, it's not slow.
Make it easy for me to generate passwords.
No. Sorry. Okay. Oh, there's one more.
Apparently there is a cost to increasing the password complexity, but that cost is really on the person who is creating the password. It's not really on the administrator or on the service. For them, it's just a matter of checking the long password. So why should they really care? Because they are not suffering the cost. Why should they care about reducing the password complexity or about the burden on the user?
Yeah, human motivation is a complicated question. I'm not sure. But maybe the answer is they don't, right? Maybe the answer is they don't. I mean, if you look at, another paper that, Danae and I did a couple of years ago, we kind of analyzed, well, which sites ask for very complicated password policies and which don't. And it was like, well, if you look at the password that Amazon demands and Gmail demands and Facebook demands and Hotmail demands, they'll take 6-character lowercase passwords, maybe it's 8 characters by now on some of them. What kind of a password does CMU demand? What kind of a password does, do universities demand? What kind of a password do government sites demand? Government sites were the worst, by far the worst. They had ridiculous passwords. What's the difference between these? Our conclusion was choice, right? Every time you log in at Amazon or Facebook, your revenue. Every time you log in at CMU, your cost. I hate to put it in terms as crass as that, but I think, if someone, I'm sure there's a guy at Amazon who says, we have to choose far stronger policies, but if you change the policy and people say, this is, too much of a pain, I don't like this, and they go somewhere else. Every time somebody doesn't log in, that's a lost revenue opportunity. So I don't know how to motivate beyond, hey, this is the way it sort of looks to me. I think, Nick, okay, Jeremiah.
So the way I personally create my passwords, I actually do have n unique passwords, but each password has some small correlation with each other password. So I just wanted to clarify, the analysis you did was assuming that users are independent.
Correct. Yeah. So that, and in addition, that there was no, that the password itself does not have hints as to which, site it serves. And I think tools like this are, most of us have come up with, and everyone has come up with some coping strategy. For some, it's writing it down. For some, it's password managers. For some, it's strategies like this. And I think that, good strategies like this where, reuse is a real vector, as I said. It's a real vector. But to withstand it, you don't necessarily need, if somebody, gets in and, gets all of the Facebook passwords and you change your Facebook password by 1 digit at Gmail or something. That can be all guys, get a thing, they run a script. They don't try all of the variations that are, edit distance one away from it. Simple tricks like this can deliver but they're very under-researched, right? Where is there's no academic paper describing the properties of what you just did, right? And maybe there should be, because it's a coping strategy that has the potential to relieve the misery of 2 billion users, right?
Well, we had one paper last year, basically.
And there should be, what I'm saying is, these are, coping with this mess is a very, and actually a very good paper. And coping with this mess is a very legitimate, but I think there's been, it's been historically difficult to pursue that line of a kind of inquiry because people will, and I don't know what the reviews on the paper said, but particularly people will say, no, you're wrong because everyone knows you should choose all the passwords, independently, and if you don't, then the guy can do, and somebody will tell you X implies Y, therefore not X implies not Y, and you're wrong, right? And I think we need to overcome that timidity and say, no, trade-offs aren't an option here. Trade-offs are necessary, and they will either be made in a systematic way or an unsystematic way. And making the trade-offs in a systematic way, as you're describing, is sensible and a good subject of inquiry. But we've kind of, somehow managed to get into this over-constrained space where anyone who says, I think I want to drop one of these constraints is accused of thought crimes, right?
So it was not a question, it was more of a remark following up on the previous question about, why do certain entities, systems administrators speak these ridiculous sets of policies? Is that by sheer meanness? And I think that the answer here, just based on the conversation that I had with people who implement actually those policies, is peer pressure to some level. So universities will federate in some sort of federations, and they decide that a given set of policies is good, and then everybody is following it. And if they don't, and if they happen to be victim of a breach, then perhaps that person is the opposite line. So you've got considerations that are completely external. In government, it's the same thing. It's a lot easier to require something that is putting a burden on the user rather than suffering a breach. And I completely buy your argument that breaches and password complexity are two different things, but I don't think that people understand that, actually. I mean, we do, but I'm not sure that, a human resource manager who is going to be in charge of firing an employee necessarily does.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about universities in particular. Is like there are constraints that even if there are people at universities that I've talked to who kind of this talk does not seem controversial to them. They say, yeah, I've known all this for 5 years. I mean, finally, academic people are starting to catch up to it. But because of in common or other things, if my university has to join this network, that's it. There's, here it's a compliance regime. Or we get an auditor who comes through once a year, and they told us you have to do this, 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 and this. And those are real constraints too, right? It would be nice if we could kind of get to, there's been a lot of just not clear thinking in this space, right? And I think, I mean, the papers that you guys have produced and the papers that, Leibniz University and the various other kind of, groups that are looking at this and we're starting to get to a clearer understanding of what makes a difference and what we're doing. And that's it's slower than we would like, but I think that's maybe we can get people to finally recognize that we could be doing better here, right? I mean, the point with the waste of effort in that gap between online and offline is, well, we ask a lot of users. If we're wasting effort in that gap, instead of saying, hey, we want 20-digit passwords, well, the effort is kind of a zero-sum game, right? Are we honestly saying that we can't think of the better things that users could be spending that effort on? Anyway, okay. Oh, still one more? Okay.
Sorry, I just have one quick question. So I'd like to discuss a little bit about something that you did not talk about, which is a password requirement where some sites or some administrative services will require a user to change their password periodically, monthly or yearly. And it seems like this is something that's going to add to the amount of effort it takes a user to deal with deal with their passwords. What kind of effectiveness do you think this has? Or is it just some sort of way to tease users into using a unique password for their particular service?
So let me respond with a joke and a reference to a real paper that studied this question. The joke is, there's a talk, Peter Gutman, a really good guy in New Zealand, has a talk, and he's talking about password craziness, and he says, well, does anyone even remember what the purported reason why we expire passwords every 90 days is? And he leaves a question mark. And then the next slide is a picture from, what's his name, Topal from the Fiddler of the Roof, singing tradition. It's just, I think that's why. It's tradition. There's a lot of stuff we do for that. There's a really good paper on this from Zhang, Monrose, and Reiter at UNC. They were able to do a study, and other good groups working on password stuff, where they got, I think what happened was the university kind of forced a rotation of the entire university. So what they got was, they got access to the old passwords that were now expired, and they said, tell you what we're going to do. Let us take these old passwords, and then we'll compute some guesses, and then you just take them into the cage. And don't tell us what the new passwords are, but tell us how well we succeeded with these guessing strategies. And long story short, I'm going to mangle the numbers a bit, but I think it was on the order of 50% of the new passwords they were able to guess from the old ones on the order of, was it 7 guesses or 5 guesses? It was, in other words, what do you think is going to happen? Everyone has some kind of, rotation strategy. So in addition, whatever the goal we had in mind, it is clear that they are not accomplishing that goal unless, withstanding 7 guesses was the goal you had in mind. But it takes someone to, many of us have been frustrated with that stuff for a while, but it takes someone, to do a good measurement on a real system to actually, many places still do it. But I think people are waking up to, this is not doing as much as we thought. And the only way of doing it is kind of doing it the way those guys at UNC do it, and the way CMU does it, and the way I try to do it, which is, try to beat back the darkness and one little thing at a time. Okay. Thank you so much.